Welcome everyone to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, November 12th, 2020. Hope everybody is holding up well out there. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented Part 1, World Trade Center 7. This is Part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. And also, we're going to be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. You can submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. You just go to that website and click Continuing Education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at the Facebook comments under this video and the YouTube comments for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard is going to be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office structure, and parking. Altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. And I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get right into it. Just first, in terms of the design, some hailed it as the crowning achievement of the international style, the Twin Towers. Others, heartless modernism. Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, which they were at the time that they were built. And we have compare that to the Empire State Building, the beautiful unfolding massing of Art Deco style. And quite a distinct departure from an effort at real design, in my opinion. But the engineering innovations were extraordinary. First, getting nearly 140,000 visitors and 50,000 occupants to their destinations every day in 100 elevator cabs. I mean, how do you do that? Well, they accomplished this 3-part system where you would transfer at these sky lobbies. And that was quite innovative, actually. And more so the structural part of this building, because up until this time, these buildings, the office skyscrapers had a forest of columns. And what they had to do, what they quite really impacted the ability to lay out furniture, office space, and so forth. So with the Twin Towers, they pushed out half the columns to the outside in these 3 vertical and 3 horizontal spandrel panels welded in the shop and come out and erected quite efficiently on the site. And in the middle, 47 massive core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches at the base, solid steel, at the mid space, 16 by 22. And in between these 2 structures were laid these floor panels supported by these T-bar joists, thin steel joists with 4-inch thick and then 8-inch thick concrete on the mechanical floors. So this tied the structure together, but that allowed incredible open office planning, 60 feet on one side, 35 feet on the other side. So you see something that has never been seen in skyscraper construction for the previous 100 years, openness. But nevertheless, there were still problems associated with the design. Some in the 80s, for instance, the cityscape below was opened up with these picturesque views and windows, whereas in the Twin Towers we have a column marching every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building. Some likened it to a jail cell. The ceilings were lower than modern skyscrapers, also at 9 feet here. And they required, at the time of 2001 anyway, the incredible cost of upgrading the mechanical, electrical, and communications equipment. The city of New York was requiring the Port Authority to abate the asbestos in these buildings because they were built during the 70s when that was widely used, according to federal law. And so this was needing to be done. And yet we have Larry Silverstein acquiring these properties in a shady deal that went down just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, from public hands into private hands, and investing only, some say 15 million of his own money, some say 100, but a $3.2 billion leveraged deal where he then acquired these buildings. And he must have known the incredible problems associated with them. He did put an immense terrorist insurance on these, 10 times what was previously held on these buildings, which is an extraordinary situation all by itself. But let's leave the speculation aside and jump to the development of the official story and see how this happened that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell, right there from Gene Corley. Where did it come from? Maybe that guy on the street. I witnessed. Who talks like that? Anyway, we'll leave that speculation aside and find out about this official story and see if it's true. First, the plane impacts. We have in the North Tower, which was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses over an hour and a half later. Now, some people associate the impact of the planes and the large explosion of jet fuel as to the cause of these collapses. But no, even NIST acknowledges that the jet fuel was burned up, mostly 90% of it outside the building. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. It merely started the fires, which then went on, in this case, for another 80 minutes or so. In the case of the South Tower, it was hit at 9:03 in the morning. It collapses an hour later. So we have essentially a collapse theory by office fires and some broken columns due to the airplane impact. And we'll come to that in a moment. But they had some official investigations. The American Society of Civil Engineers in 2001 had volunteers which showed up, and they worked their way, these handpicked volunteers, all the way into the final version through FEMA and then through NIST. Many of them did. And regarding the FEMA report, the New York Times documents that they didn't have access to the blueprints of the buildings, the adequate site access to the public to get more photographs and so forth. It was really quite a controlled project, and ultimately given over to NIST who produced their report in 2005, finally had $20 million worth of funding, a semi-reasonable amount of dollars, and we'll find out what they did with those tax dollars in a moment. NIST is a National Institute of Standards and Technology. They were tasked by Congress here to explain the collapses to the American people, and we'll see how they did with that. They're part of the executive branch of government. Their leadership was replaced by the Bush administration prior to taking on this project. And the column failure theory is what NIST came up with. How does that work? Well, this large fire, they said, was burning at the time of the collapse, caused the floor trusses to fail. They sagged. When they sagged, they're saying that lack of stiffness caused a pulling in of the perimeter columns. And the problem here is that sagging floor trusses cannot pull in perimeter columns, and not 14-inch square steel tube columns that we have here. So NIST, in their computer model, imposed an 5,000-pound artificial load on every column all the way around the building, forcing them to fail so that they could get their initiation of failure through the column failure theory. So we will be exposing the frauds of NIST here one at a time, beginning with the fire itself. The fires were diminished at the time of the collapse, actually. Thick black smoke indicating the cooler and oxygen-starved fires. So we have a problem right off the bat, of course. This is why we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We formulate a question: how do the towers collapse? We do some background research, we make some observations, we construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how these towers collapse. Maybe the jet planes and broken columns caused the collapse. Perhaps it was the fire and the jet fuel. Perhaps it was explosions, which are a significant part of the evidence that was omitted by NIST, actually. And controlled demolition, same points made here. We take all of the rational hypotheses that could be true. We don't focus in on one of them due to our financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of what caused the collapse of these towers. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work we're doing and trust for instance, our input data that was actually hidden and refused to be seen by NIST. NIST refused to allow others to see it. And we talked about that last week. And by the way, if you missed last week's presentation in this 3-part series. I encourage you to take a look at it. We repeat it every month, the first, second, and third Thursdays of each month at 1 p.m. Pacific. But it's free on YouTube, and you can go there and find it. 9/11, An Architect's Guide, World Trade Center, Building 7. That's part 1 of this 3-part series. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis. That's what we're about today, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated, supported by the experiments, the analysis, and so forth. So let's begin by doing some background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? Fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic and chaotic process, though. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes, moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So if we have, even NIST acknowledges this, the fires didn't persist in any one location for more than about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So how in the world do they get uniform failure of the floor trusses all the way around the building virtually at the same time? It's a complete contradiction. Skyscrapers, this is another contradiction, have never collapsed before 9/11 due to steel frame fireproof skyscrapers due to fires. But say in a wood frame building, the building would fall over to the path of least resistance. It wouldn't fall straight down through all the tons of structure intact below it. It would be a chaotic process. But what about steel frame buildings? We actually had a test in the UK in 1995. They built an 8-story steel frame building with, as you can see, a whole lot of kindling to make the hottest fires they possibly could. They tried to reach 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you can also see, they had some beams, steel beams that were not fireproofed, and they had some that were. And we looked at this video last week, and we found that the steel structure, some of it sagged as was expected. But even when we don't have fireproofing, we did not have failure of the structural steel connections. This is extremely important because it pulls the rug out from underneath NIST in several respects, as we'll see. But let's look at fires that have been burning, engulfing buildings prior to 9/11 and see what's happened to those.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these skyscrapers that were also fully engulfed in fire after 9/11. It doesn't happen to steel frame skyscrapers. And yet these fires diminished at the time of the collapse, brought the Twin Towers down. So, what other possibilities are there? Well, let's continue our research and find out about natural collapses, in this case by earthquakes, which have brought tall buildings down. But you see, the building is recognizable as a building after it's fallen. It's certainly badly damaged, but the columns and the beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So let's keep this in mind as to what we might expect from a tall building that has collapsed. And these buildings, which exploded, we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized building materials, expanding clouds in cauliflower-shaped forms, rapidly expanding due to the incredible heat from the hot gases from the explosives. And we have witnesses that hear those explosives. We have witnesses that see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story of the Twin Towers destruction, save those explosions that occurred when the planes hit the towers. We'll be looking at lots and lots of that kind of additional evidence, though. Controlled demolitions can bring buildings down, where we professionally demolish a building by placing thousands of shaped cutter charges at the columns and beams in the building, and then set them off in a synchronized fashion, usually from the bottom up to the top. So with this kind of demolition, which is only capable of being done by a half a dozen companies in the United States, we have a set of typical features associated with those. A sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. They can do that anywhere you want, as you'll see. And feature number 2, a straight down symmetrical collapse, if that's what they want to achieve. It's certainly possible into the building's own footprint, if that's what they want to do. And usually it is in an urban area. You don't want the building falling over to hit other buildings. And this is resulted by a patterned removal of column supports, synchronistically timed floor by floor. And that results in a free fall acceleration also. What does that mean? It's falling as fast as a bowling ball from the top of the building. That's free fall, no resistance, through the path of what was supposed to be the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure that's in the way. And this results, of course, also in feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment, a very efficient process in the controlled demolition industry. There's limited damage to adjacent structures, of course, that's at least the goal there, and patterned explosions that are heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. And we have broken up concrete floors, or pulverized in the case of normal controlled demolitions. They break them up so they don't have to do that afterward in a pile at all odd angles with jackhammers and so forth. So that's done by explosives. So there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. They're just obviously explosions going off here and there around the building, isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry, resulting, of course, in feature number 10, chemical evidence of these explosive devices left behind in the residue in the aftermath of a controlled demolition. All this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Fire causes structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance, i.e. they'll typically fall over if they get started and collapse a building. Why haven't we had a collapse of a high-rise fire? Well, the steel conducts this heat away from the source. So we never really get a 1200 degree temperature at the source of a steel frame building, which is critical because it can the steel only has half of its strength left, and it can begin to bend at that point, 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we want to keep that from happening. So we put cementitious fireproofing on our steel frame structures. And that's really important. This is 2 and 3 hour fire protection. That means that the fire has to burn more than 2 hours on the columns, on the beams, and then more than 3 hours on the columns. But we also have non-combustible buildings. We don't build tall buildings out of combustible materials like we do houses, for instance, which are made of wood. And we keep the tenants from bringing in large fuel loads. We regulate that very carefully. And just to keep all of that from becoming a problem, we sprinkler the buildings so that they're not, we don't have any fire to deal with at all. So a highly redundant set of circumstances here. In the case of the Twin Towers, we're told the sprinkler systems became inactive by the impact of the airplanes. So, and we don't dispute that. Because we're looking at evidence here for something else, something extraordinary that was completely omitted by NIST. And we would have government documentation in controlled demolitions. You don't just go out and do this in an afternoon. You have to have government approval, of course, normally. So there's foreknowledge of the destruction as well. Experts who see videos of it agree, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts who don't have financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a particular building was destroyed by controlled demolition. Along with video documentation, that can all be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we're going to apply now to the destruction of the Twin Towers. Let's begin with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Let's look at the North Tower. It's standing there, and all of a sudden, it begins a smooth downward motion. No hesitation, no jolt at the impact of floors, but it just continues all the way down. Let's go to the South Tower. It's standing there, and all of a sudden, a smooth downward motion, no jolt or hesitation yet again at impact. How about patterned explosions and flashes of light? Let's jump to the oral histories produced by Thomas von Essen, the city fire commissioner, who sought to preserve these accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory. So we have 12,000 pages of testimony. 500 first responders orally recorded their stories. And finally, we got this information in August of 2005 when the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release it. And the New York Times actually put these transcripts online. And it turns out that at the time of the work of Graham McQueen in 2011, he found 118 firefighters observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena of explosive demolition before the towers came down and during. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again with these witnesses, you're going to see a very specific order of events, which is extremely important because we're told that these sounds that were heard by these witnesses were told by NIST that these are the sounds of one floor hitting another, which were mistaken as explosions, because remember, explosions are not a part of the official story after the explosions of the airplanes. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It felt like a train running underneath my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, And then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the top. Simultaneously, from all four sides, material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about here as we look at the descent of the North Tower on the right and a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever. Should not controlled demolition have been the first hypothesis, if not the only rational one to be examined by NIST? But no, it was relegated for years in unanswered questions, finally put on their website years later on their FAQ section, very frequently asked questions. And NIST says, we don't support the controlled demolition theory. The collapse was initiated in the impact and fire floors of the World Trade Center and nowhere else. In other words, typical controlled demolition started at the base of the building, and this one didn't, so it can't be a controlled demolition, right? We will refute that in a moment. Video evidence also showed, they say, unambiguously, that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. Blast or explosions in the region below the impact and fire floors in the top building sections began their downward movement upon collapse initiation. NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives. Well, did they look? Well, did they listen to these witnesses? You ever see professional demolition, this firefighter says, this paramedic, where they set charges on certain floors and then you hear a pop, pop, pop. When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode, says FDNY Captain Karen DeShore. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. Saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes, flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. You actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially orange, and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially, again, since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, and fire has never caused a skyscraper to collapse. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then there were a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud, earth-shattering blast with large fireball that blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think at this point, still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these witnesses and see if we can get some corroboration here.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was no secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to play on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses do you imagine ended up in the report of NIST on the collapse of these buildings? Not one. No witnesses of explosions. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, let's listen to an expert on this subject, Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And here's a top-down controlled demolition as well. You can go almost anywhere in the building, he says. Well, NIST says that the upper block of floors drove the rest of the building down to the ground after that column failure that we already talked about. And then this block destroyed itself. That's the official theory. Unfortunately, it defies Newton's third law of motion, an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide, such as a Volkswagen and a Mack truck. Which one wins? The Mack truck. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck? No, the lightest structure cannot possibly destroy a much heavier, colder, hard steel that's stronger and stronger with each floor. At the top, you have maybe 3/8 inch thick steel. But as you go down, the steel gets heavier and heavier. These core columns are increasingly heavier, 2 inch at mid height and almost solid steel at the base. So that the Volkswagen of the top of this pyramid is not going to destroy the Mack truck below. This is intuitive. And yet it evolves from this in very obscure paper that's extremely complex, produced by Zdenek Bazant of Chicago Northwestern University, submitted just 2 days after 9/11. This is his crush down, crush up theory. There's some problems with it. It violates the laws of physics. The formulas are actually correct, but the input data, which are garbage in, garbage out. You ever heard that term? We got a lot of garbage in going on here. First of all, the whole thing is obfuscated, so you can't even tell. Even seasoned structural engineers, it took them quite a while to decode this. And second, they completely eliminate a whole story of columns so that they can get a 12-foot drop free of any resistance of any of those columns to create a dynamic impact on the structure below. Well, that's fraud right there. They doubled the mass up above. That's fraud. They decreased the column strength below by 3 times. That's fraud. What they ended up doing is causing a failure, a formula that's rigged 12-1 in favor of a collapse. This is the kind of science that we're given. It's not science at all. So the actual measured data, measured by Chandler, David Chandler, physics teacher, from the video, it is almost free fall. Bazant theorized somewhat close to that. But in reality, what would happen is that the downward movement would be completely arrested after 2 seconds in a natural collapse. And this is proven by, oh, look at all this. I got to get rid of this. Hold on 1 second. So these errors are refuted by engineers, and they were submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the same publication that this original paper by Zdenek Bazant was published in, but the American Society of Civil Engineers won't publish it. Why? Because it's out of scope, they say. Well, this is a real problem. It's not out of scope to produce a professional paper highlighting real problems with a previously produced paper. And so there's an ethics case that's been filed on this subject that's pending. Now, NIST says that this pile driver drove the rest of the building down, but I'm going to show you the video, and you tell me if you can find a pile driver driving the rest of the building down. Let's make it easier for you. Watch the lower red line. That upper part is destroying itself, just like the Volkswagen would if we dropped it on the Mack truck. In the first couple of seconds, it's destroying itself. The question is, what's destroying it? We're coming to that. This upper block is not destroying the block below. You can see the explosions inside that upper block that are destroying it. Here, as we start and stop, you can see, just like the firefighters described, all the way around the building, these bands of explosions and continuing. And in fact, there is column failure. NIST used the video, which is looped here, to discover that fact. As you see around the corner again and again in this looped video, the question is, what's destroying those columns? Well, let's jump to a video from the author of the FEMA report, which gives us our first clue here.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
The antenna falls, and that tells us that the core columns let go first, not the perimeter columns, as NIST explained or claimed. Well, what does the antenna sit on? The antenna sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So the core columns fail. That allows the antenna to come down. So how is the floor, the core columns failing? Let's take a look here. In this crude animation, if the core columns down below are cut or damaged, then the core is going to drop first. That's the antenna sitting on top of it. And it's going to pull on those trusses, which are in turn going to pull on the core columns. Hold on one second. I'm going to add another slide here to make this easier for you. Head loop of column inward buckling. All right. Now, none of the photographs or videos show a section of this building driving the rest of the building down to the ground. They simply don't do it. It's not there to be shown. It's been destroyed, as you saw in the first 4 seconds. And if it was there, it would have driven these few remaining core columns after the collapse of this building. It would have driven them down to the ground with it. But they remain. So how can the Zdenek-Bezant theory be applicable at all whatsoever? And then something shakes it and it descends frame by frame, going down, as if there is another charge that finally goes off down below. We don't know. Well, that's speculation at that point. But that does descend straight down. Now, does it even look like a gravitational collapse? It looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009, with upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we will get to. Doesn't look anything like a gravitational collapse. This is why 36 honest reporters in the early days following 9/11 were reporting on explosions being the key theory, with all of this evidence, because all of these eyewitnesses of explosions. And you can review this important work by Graham McQueen and Ted Walter, which concludes that the hypothesis of explosions bringing down the towers was not only prevalent among reporters, but was in fact the dominant hypothesis in the early days. And then it got swept under the rug when the national media began to take over. Feature number 3, do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint? Well, nearly so. The south tower begins to actually tilt. Let's look at this. It tilts. Uh-oh. Let's see. All right, we'll come back to 237. We're going to bring that back up again. And make it behave this time. Well, we're going to try. And we'll just go into here and then start that from the current slide and try it this way. All right. That south tower is leaning, falling 22 degrees off center. So there's asymmetrical loading on the structure below. There's asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. There's asymmetrical damage from the fires. So how can we have complete symmetrical damage all the way down the building? It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. We might have expected that falling 22-degree top to continue falling off. Let's zoom in and look at this section. It's the leading corner of this set of what are obviously explosions. Hundreds of them just right here. Small explosions. Lots of small explosions. What else? The gravitational collapse is like 20 stories up above. What's going on here? Look at it from another angle in the lower right. You see the same leading edge of these explosions. Not to mention this incredibly violent series of explosions in the foreground here, which we will come to in a moment, actually. So the building is 200 feet wide, but the debris is 12 to 1,400 feet wide, well outside the perimeter of the World Trade Center. Destroying the winter gardens here more than 600 feet away from the North Tower. The steel is broken up, ready for loading and shipment. The entire World Trade Center complex is filled with these structural steel elements. They're not missing. They weren't turned to dust. They're found all over the place. 200,000 tons of it all together. And what about the ejections of these materials? Let's take a look at these squibs, the isolated explosive ejections occurring here and here. 20, 40, even 60 stories down, as you see here, in each of the towers. Explosions going off with solid materials ejected. NIST says, well, these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver. Well, we saw that pile driver was destroyed in the first few seconds. It's not even there. None of the photos show it. None of the videos show it. And they said, well, let's say it was, though. And that air has to come down the elevator hoistway and come out arbitrarily at these floors. Well, it would fill the place with uniform air pressure and blow out maybe all the windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate violent ejections that we see here. Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler and learn something about these ejections. We'll do that next. But look at the left side of the south tower, where we see dozens of simultaneous and fairly uniform ejections of these explosions again and again and again. Now let's look at them, look at the physics of these ejections with physics teacher.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the south tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
So these ejections are occurring at 150 miles per hour, 160 to 200 feet per second. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure being produced by some kind of piston. Let's see how fast these buildings are coming down, because this is extremely relevant. Let's count it and get a visual on it too. Here's 4 seconds, 7 seconds. Oop, the counter stopped. 8 seconds, 10 seconds. In about 10 seconds, the building has been completely destroyed from top to bottom, shattering the structural steel sections. Now, let's try to determine what that means. Let's go back to David Chandler, physics teacher.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant.
Let's try this again.
Downward acceleration.
There we go.
The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% free fall.
64% of free fall. The building is almost in free fall. It's getting faster and faster and faster. It's not decelerating. It's not getting slower as it goes through what? 80,000 tons of intact, cold, hard structural steel below, designed 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to hold that building up. It's not even slowing it down. Why not? Well, because when a column, indicated by this vertical piece here, is crushed, indicated by P1, a force, there is buckling. The column will fail, but even as it's failing and after it fails, it still provides a minimum resistance. And often that minimum resistance is about a quarter of its original strength, which means that's resistance. It would slow it down. That's what resistance does, slows things down. So it can't speed it up. Look at it another way. You have a huge section of the World Trade Center held up over the rest of the World Trade Center below it. We'll even give a imaginary and magic 12-foot removal of those columns, just like Zdenek Bazant did earlier. We're going to let that go, but at the same time, we're going to let go an equal 15-story section, like in the North Tower of World Trade Center. What's going to happen here? Which one hits the ground first? The one on the left or the one on the right? This is 7th grade physics. everybody knows that if there's some resistance, it's going to slow down that object. It's not even going to hit the ground, right? And yet, that's what happens. There's another way to look at this. From Massimo Mazzucco's New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that is why we have Zudolinski, Zambodi, and Johns submitting a peer-reviewed paper that was published in the Journal of Protective Structures, finally. So that one generated a lot of controversy, and we're working on the American Society of Civil Engineers still. Now, do we have feature number 6, the shattering of the structural steel frame? Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigations, the guide used throughout this country for fire and explosion investigation, says, look for shrapnel effects, one of the effects of explosions, high order damage characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. And that's exactly what we have. The complete shattering of the structure from top to bottom, save these remaining shards on the side. And broken up and ready for loading and shipment, the columns into their 37.5-foot lengths. How about lateral ejection? What are we talking about here? Again, we go back to NFPA 921, which says, look for blast pressure wave effects also, i.e. heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, like you see the evidence of here impaling local buildings around. And here, out of the World Trade Center, freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 to 8 tons. And this one particularly is interesting. Back to, forward to, back to, forward to. That's 45 degrees. How does gravity work? Down. What's happening here? Out. What force is propelling this structural steel piece out? And we'll come back to why a piece of structural steel is trailed by thick white smoke clouds when we get to next week's series. We get to extreme heat. But for now, let's look at the physics of this ejection with physics teacher David Chandler.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
So 80 miles an hour, these 4-ton structural steel sections are hurled. That's enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's all this energy come from? Because there's thousands of these freely flying structural steel sections. And by the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is hurled laterally outside the tower's footprint, what's left to crush the building? Because it's not the steel. It's not 100,000 tons of steel. You say the concrete, it must be the concrete. We'll come to that because that's where we're heading next. Because what did happen to the concrete? We're missing floors, lots of floors, like 110 of them. Where are they? The photograph on the left shows a twisted pile of steel. 110 floors of concrete are missed. A real gravitational collapse shows pancakes in Mexico. What's going on with the Twin Towers? Where is the concrete? There it is, pulverized in midair. All the photographs, all the videos show in each building 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to 100 micron particles on average. What is the energy that's crushing these? They don't even make it to the ground. We saw that. Well, they do, but they distribute laterally over the entire island across Manhattan in a 3-inch pile. Not in the World Trade Center building footprint. This has been studied. Up to 30% of this dust is powdered concrete. Let's go to the governor.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
And that dust spread across lower Manhattan. So how, if the concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, could it be crushing the building? So the steel and the concrete are 2/3 the weight of this building. And they're not available to crush it. So what's crushing it? It's not being crushed. You saw yourself. It was being blown apart. And the only file cabinet that survived was this one. There must have been 10,000 steel file cabinets in that building. What about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on top of this Deutsche Bank building here. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane that hit the South Tower because its ejections went out the other way. They didn't come from the people in this airplane that hit the North Tower because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by World Trade Center 2, the South Tower. And many of them were from firefighters, which we can tell by the red triangles. But the firefighters, of course, weren't even on the scene at the time of the airplane impacts. So it's not from the people in the planes. There was 2,753 victims altogether, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 21,900 pieces of bodies found, 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for. No trace whatsoever. Vaporized. And the pieces they did find are spread 800 feet outside the World Trade Center. How did they get way over here? Can a gravitational collapse cause this incredible pulverization and distribution of these bodies? Well, what have we been looking at today? Is this direct evidence of destruction with explosives? Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Especially these fires, diminished at the time of the collapse. And surely these fires would be extinguished by the action of the collapse of the Twin Towers. We'll get to that next week, because there were extreme temperatures that are found that can't be explained by these fires. But regarding the testimony of the first responders, we found 118 witnesses of explosions. And now we're going to look at one more, very important one, the Earth Observatory from Lamont Doherty. Columbia University runs this observatory 20 miles north of Manhattan. And what did they find? That there were actual seismic signals near the time of the plane impacts. The official narrative says this is due to the plane impacts. Okay, a reasonable assumption, but let's look at it. The first impact produces a 0.9 magnitude. The seismic event near the time of the first impact produces a 0.9 magnitude event. At the second impact, we have a 0.7 magnitude impact. So let's break it down. We have the seismic event itself occurring at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the plane impact, per the National Transportation Safety Board radar, which is accurate to within a second, says it didn't happen for 14 seconds. So how can the plane impact cause that seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer to this. They say, we looked at the videos and we don't think that the NTSB radar is accurate. We think we're accurate. So they gain 10 seconds there. And then they go back to, they're still 4 seconds off. So they go back to Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and privately contract with them. And there's a report produced that moves this entire set of data back 3 seconds. But we don't get to see that report. They're still off by a second, but that's within their tolerance. All right. Let's take a look at the second plane impact, which occurs at 9:02 and 54. Excuse me. The seismic signal occurs at 9:02 and 54. But again, the plane doesn't impact until 17 seconds later. So how can it produce the seismic signal? This says, well, I don't believe the NTSB radar. I think the plane impact occurred 12 seconds earlier. Now, worldwide, the NTSB radar is used and is accurate to within a second, mind you. But they're still 5 seconds off. So what do? They get Lamont Doherty to move this seismic signal back 3 seconds also. So now they're only off by 2 seconds. Privately handled transaction here between NIST and LDEO. We can't get the records on the reasons for this data to move back. Well, what might have caused a seismic signal that far away? from the airplane impact? Well, Mike Picaro says the whole building seemed to shake. There was a loud explosion down in the basement. They arrived at the sea level and found the machine shop gone, nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking garage and found that it too was gone. A huge explosion had gone off. The steel and concrete door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the ground. So an explosion in the basement before the plane impacted the building. Here's another witness of that, and two, in fact, three more. And Willie Rodriguez, who famously was in the basement when the explosion happened below him, he said. And then he heard the plane up high.
Was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
And another expert, Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. Weighing in, he says the frequency of the Raleigh wave, seismic waves, attributed by LDEO to the impacts are on the order of 1 hertz. But aircraft and crash impacts have higher frequencies, above 10 and often up to 100 hertz. These frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters used by LDEO. They couldn't even pick up aircraft crashes. The seismic component equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz, not an order of magnitude or two above that. So he says the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened before hitting the ground. That's a professional opinion. Well, let's look at the collapses themselves, because there were also seismic impacts around the time of the collapse. In both the South Tower and also the North Tower, which produced a 2.3 magnitude. So let's look at these. The seismic event comes in at 10:28 and 31 seconds. But the tower starts descending 9 seconds before that. And the first debris, though, doesn't hit the pavement until a second after that. And the heaviest debris doesn't hit the pavement until another 4 seconds after that. So how could it be causing that vibration? I mean, that seismic event. Well, NIST has an answer to this. They move, once again, the data for this event back 3 seconds. They say, gosh, it lines up better for us now. But we don't get to know what's going on there with that report because it was never released. Well, another omission here is the clearly defined P wave and S wave, primary and shear waves. And those are coming in early, as they're supposed to. And they're very well defined, but they were ignored by LDEO. Well, this is important because this is 4 seconds before the tower started its descent. So what could be causing those early waves? Well, we're going to be looking at yet another witness, which is a set of cameras on tripods which detect explosions 6 and 10 seconds before the tower starts its descent, and which corroborate the firefighter eyewitnesses that we talked about. Let's look at this one. This is a camera on a tripod documented by Graham McQueen, who did the work on this, 2009, did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground. So here is it still, and there you see the shake. I'm not doing that. It's on the public video. You can see it yourself. And then 6 seconds, the tower comes down. So the ground is shaking, just like the firefighter described before the tower came down. Here too, in this case, 10 seconds before the North Tower comes down, we have the ground, which in this case is a rooftop on which there's a shake. And then there's a lot of explosive action on the top of the building. And now the building begins to come down 10 seconds afterwards. So corroborating the first responders. So let's go to the South Tower. We have the start of the seismic event at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The start of the tower collapse occurs 5 seconds earlier than that, but its first debris doesn't hit the ground until 7 seconds after that. So how can the collapse of that tower cause that seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer to this. They contract with LDEO and get them to move their data back again 3 seconds. Well, what could explain the LDEO data here, but camera shakes yet again 3 seconds before what? The start of the collapse. So the camera is shaking, and again, you can actually see the increase from background static here to not as well-defined primary and shear waves, but still more buildup prior to the overall event. In this case, New York 1 camera, which we're going to look at right now, mounted on a tripod and starting the video, and the shake is more subtle in this case, right there. And then 3 seconds later, the tower starts to fall. We'll do that one again. Okay, starting. The video starting now. And there was the shake. It was very subtle. And then the tower, 3 seconds after, the tower starts to come down. So you can look at this work of Graham McQueen's, and I encourage you to do this. Again, 2009, Graham McQueen did the South Tower shake. In this case, yes, the South Tower. So the official narrative is that seismic signals caused that were measured near the time of the collapse is due to the debris hitting the ground, but we have a another problem with this whole theory. The concrete floors and roof trusses and gypsum board walls, all building contents were all pulverized to dust. There's no seismic component whatsoever from the concrete. Again, that's a third the weight of this building. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, peppering the surface. And they're only 4 to 8 tons each. They're not going to make a seismic component individually. They're not peppering the ground. They're hitting a 7-story tall concrete basement structure, which is further attenuating those seismic signals that are never going to reach Palisades, New York, 20 miles north. And they're equally distributed over the entire World Trade Center block. It doesn't come down in place, as we talked about. It's a 1,400-foot diameter. Now, these nearly identical buildings and their nearly identical collapses are dramatically different seismic strengths. 1.6 times greater in one case. That cannot be accounted for by the minor differences in the buildings, such as one having an antenna and one not. 2.1 on the Richter scale for South Tower, 2.3 for the North Tower. This is 1.6 times the energy. It's a logarithmic scale. So you have to take that into account. So it can't, something else has to be responsible, such as explosions that are very different explosions in each case. Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extreme different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Well, this is nicely documented in the Consensus 9/11 panel, the best evidence panel, produced by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. Point TT7, why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. Highly recommend consensus911.org. Some people say, gosh, if the Twin Towers should have made much more seismic chaos when they fell. After all, there are 110 stories. And they're comparing it to the Seattle Kingdom. Well, this is a 25,000 ton concrete roof impacting the ground virtually at once, versus the powdered concrete, which is not impacting the ground seismically at all because it's powder. The steel peppering 1,400-foot diameter, one at a time, etc. So keep that in mind when you hear things like that too. So this documentation is very, very well made by others as well. Craig Furlong, Gordon Ross. So we also have the NIST report. Let's look at it. We have Congress tasking NIST to explain how and why the Twin Towers collapsed. Last week we looked at Building 7 and how and why it collapsed and how they failed there as well. NIST did. And that's available for you on YouTube. 9/11, an architect's guide. But NIST had apparently their own objective hidden in footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? You stopped at the initiation of collapse? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait, you spent $20 million of our taxpayer money having been tasked to explain the actual collapse, and you stopped before the collapse began? 10,000 pages? 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes? And only a half a page on the events following collapse initiation? Well, let's look at that. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. It came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is not analysis with supporting calculations. It's pure speculation. This is a pre-collapse report. Should have been titled "The Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse." Why would they have failed to go any further? Because they would have had to incorporate into their report all of the evidence which occurs after and during the collapse, the evidence of explosions, which we've been giving to you in this second series, and we'll give you more in the third part of this three-part series. So we put forth a request for correction, which you can do with federal agencies who hide truths from their final reports like this. And they wrote back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. We do agree. In fact, they go on and say, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Well, you can't find what you won't test for, can you? They said, well, we didn't have to test for explosive residue because we never would have found it. That's pretty circular reasoning. Experts disagree. Here's one. Of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. William Rice. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Van Romero, New Mexico tech expert. Explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Of course, he recanted this story, this opinion, because presumably his university, New Mexico Tech, gets lots and lots of federal grants. As did Mathis Levy, who joined FEMA after making this statement.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
As did Ronald Hamburger before he joined the FEMA team. Appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Well, who told him no bombs had been detonated? He didn't see our evidence, apparently. Mike Taylor, executive director. The collapse of the World Trade Center looked like a classic controlled demolition. Andre Rousseau, even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles away and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. How about the evidence itself? Surely the two worst structural failures in modern history, the evidence would be preserved and answers sought. This structural engineer had to say about that. Abul Hassan Astani Asl, professor at UC Berkeley.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent over steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent over steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing.
15 cents a pound sent to China for recycling. Before forensic investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic investigation, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it did not. Of course, in easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, we have 400 truckloads per day carted away starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, sent to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is why so many, through the use of the scientific method, have arrived at the conclusion not that jet planes and fires brought these buildings down, but that explosions and controlled demolitions, and as we'll see next week, incendiaries brought them down. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of these features can be accounted for by fire. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we find this proof of controlled demolition, proof that has prompted 3,000 architects and engineers to put their reputations on the line, demanding a new investigation. You might have some questions for us at this time. If you're watching us live, I encourage you to submit your questions. Andy, how do they do that?
Okay, thank you so much. Please submit your questions that you might have in the same input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org under continuing education, and then you select the live webinars, and we will do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
All right. And while you're there, by the way, I would like you to submit your email so we can stay in touch. My slide is not going forward. Boy, I hate that when that happens. We're gonna take that one down again, and come on. We want you to sign up. Andy, tell them why. Well, I'm trying to figure this out. Why it's so important for people to keep in touch with us.
All right. Well, I love their chat. Melodic sounding. Yeah, this is what the reason you sign up for our emails is to keep track of what we are doing, and a lot of times we'll put out calls to action because we can't do it alone. Obviously, we do a lot ourselves, but a lot of our work is on the work of the supporters as well. You know, like for instance, when we have National Call-In Day to members of Congress about this issue, and we put forth the Bobby McIlvaine Act, we got a pretty good response there. Or if we want you to set up meetings with your members of Congress, which we'll be talking about a little bit down the road here today. So, you know, that's why you put your email in the email box and keep track of what we're doing. You can keep track of our progress. And then when there's new developments, for instance, the University of Alaska study, you can know about it, tell all your friends about it, and get the word of mouth going. Because as we have learned, and as it's been made abundantly clear in the past many years, the mainstream media is not going to help us. They're not here to help. They're here to handle us. So you have to do that work and get informed on what's going on.
And if you don't want to be handled, subscribe to our email newsletter. We give you instructions on how to get yourself informed, so you're not subject to being lied to by those folks out there that aren't putting this information up in front of the American people because they don't want them to know the truth. So get informed yourself. Jump to our website and look at the videos, the papers, the documents, all lots and lots and lots of detailed evidence on our website. Sign the petition supporting 3,000 architects and engineers. You don't have to be an architect and an engineer yourself, but if you are, we want you to sign also. Because we keep track of these separately, and donate if you can't do that. Support us at least with your donation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we're all over the country doing the work that has to be done to get a real investigation. And we'll give you some information about that in a second. But that's why we want you to also become a member of AE 911 Truth. For as little as a cup of coffee a month, you can keep us going. We have 1,000 supporters who do just that. And so we need to grow our base so that we can grow our reach out there and put a huge dent in this wall of denial that exists out there. And if you can't do that, there's some other things you can do, right, Andy?
Absolutely. Again, as I said, we don't do it alone. We get a lot of help from very dedicated individuals. If you've got a skill or a talent that you don't think has been utilized enough in the 9/11 Truth movement, certainly bring it forward. We also got a lot of things that you can do if you don't know what to do. Trust me, we'll tell you what to do if you want. And it all depends on what kind of personality type you are, but we can find a place for you. But the first step is to go forward and volunteer. You can go to ae911truth.org, fill out a very short form. And I got a feeling now we're getting more and more people who question official narratives as we move forward here in the United States of America. Great time to take advantage of that and tell them, hey, there's some information you didn't know about what happened 20 years ago as well. So please consider doing that. And again, fill out that form.
That's right. And guess what? There's lots that you can learn about the different kinds of things you can do right online. And while maybe you want to work alone, call for a new investigation. Reach out on your own to your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everybody you know. Screen the DVDs that we have available for you in our store to friends and colleagues. Share them, and the brochures too. We have some great color brochures. You can give out, have all the evidence on them. $10 for 100 of them. Send out the results of the World Trade Center evaluation, which we discussed last week, where the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, Professor Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, produced over 4 years this finite element analysis, which concludes that it would require all the columns in the building to be removed at once in order for this building to come down, as you saw. Well, that's maybe intuitive for many of you, but for structural engineers out there, it needed to happen. We had to do this, and we're getting it out to every university in the country that has a civil engineering degree, which includes structural. And we've challenged NIST on 8 key points of evidence that they were fraudulent about. And we are in process with them in an appeal process to bring these elements to light. And it's a fascinating process. We're going to take this evidence also to Congress. How are we doing that, Andy?
Right. It's a continuing process, and a lot of it, again, depends on our supporters because, hey, we can make meetings with our representatives here on the staff, but we need to be making meetings with them all over the place. So the way that you do that first is to learn about the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who lost his life on September 11th. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower. That explanation doesn't jive well with the official explanation. So right there, we have an opening for talking to our members of Congress about this legislation. And that's exactly what it is. It's draft legislation that would create a select committee that would look into the destruction of these 3 buildings, and it's written in such a way that they have to take into account all the evidence that Richard has been presenting. So you get informed about it by going to ae911truth.org/justice. You can download a copy of the bill. You can write to your members of Congress just by filling out your address right there. You can get a copy of it and hand it to your members of Congress if they appear in your hometown doing a town hall or something like that. And get informed, get involved. If you don't have time to do all that, just make a phone call one day and say, hey, I know there's a lot going on right now, but the most important issue that a lot of this stems from is September 11th. And we've gotten down to the bottom of what really happened that day, but Congress needs to catch up and fully acknowledge this. And I think a lot of change will happen. So get behind the Bobby McIlvaine Act and do that necessary activism to get it passed.
Right on, and know that we have a set of 60 exhibits, which are currently promised by the U.S. Attorney to be given to a special grand jury. And we have sued them to make sure that that happens. And that lawsuit is pending, as is the lawsuit against the FBI, which requires them to give our evidence, which we have provided them in detail after the 9/11 Commission report was issued. So the 2015 9/11 Commission required the FBI to give them the evidence they've gotten since that issue of the original 9/11 Commission report. And they didn't give it. This would make it public. All the evidence you're seeing should be public and in the hands of Congress. And the FBI withheld it. So that's why we're suing them. And we're also petitioning for a new inquest into the death of British 9/11 victim family member Jeff Campbell. He was murdered in the North Tower, and his brother Matt is pursuing a legal action which we have raised $100,000 for. Incredible, thousands and thousands of our supporters. This is going to be awesome. It's going to be submitted very soon, and we will be apprising you of the progress of that. We expect a new inquest to generate the result based on the evidence we're submitting to them of the explosive demolition of these towers. Raise quite a stir, it will. And that evidence is nowhere more powerfully presented than in our landmark documentary 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which we've compiled interviews from 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. So here's just a taste of that.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. I think, you know, there's lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fire fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we ask them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
No, it's not science. And that's why we have the DVD for you in our store. It's free on YouTube also. But the one in our store is 90 minutes extended version, which also includes a second DVD full of additional interview from these people that we couldn't fit into the actual documentary. You can also get their 50-page booklet on this subject written by Ted Walter. And this is at beyondmisinformation.org. You can download it for free, the PDF, or you can order on our website in our store at ae911truth.org, the coffee table version, very professionally produced. Encourage you to look at that. You can see for free on YouTube 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, our classic lecture, and you can get that in our store in DVD format. Same with Ed Asner's narration of the 15-minute documentary Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7. And I think we've arrived at the question opportunity. Andy, are there any questions today?
There's one question that came. That said, if the squibs were caused by air pressure, as NIST claims, would this be the first time ever, or are there any examples other than 9/11 to offer any validity to their claim?
Well, the squibs are the isolated explosive ejections, which we saw were 20, 40, 60 stories down below the descending, what we're told is a gravitational collapse. And we found that these are occurring at 150 miles an hour, explosive speeds, and that they're fairly uniform. They appear to be, many of them, in a kind of an engineered pattern. We also learned that if there was a natural collapse, a block of building pushing down like a piston, that would have produced fairly uniform air pressure in these open office space that was created by this structure, and that it might have blown out all the windows on that floor or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections. So we did learn all that. Now, has there ever been a collapse where a collapsing portion of a building did produce air pressures that blew out any portion of it? I don't think so. We haven't had fire produce collapses in structural steel buildings, high rises. Maybe one could look up in a history of building collapses where, there have been air pressures generated inside that could blow out some windows. I assume that's possible, but that's an interesting question. Andy, you have any other thoughts about it?
I think the important thing to do is look at what is the most probable explanation and also look at the overall story. I mean, the overall story of why these twin towers went down doesn't make any sense on its face. It's a defies physics. Top part of a building can't crush the lower part without slowing as it goes. And in the case of one of these squibs, when you watch it on the video, it's so far below the collapse line, and it's just in that isolated area, or maybe two isolated areas, so far below, what is the most likely explanation? That this air pressure is being only pushed out in these two areas. Why not more areas if it is air pressure? And why so far below the collapse line? I mean, NIST has a history of just coming up with stuff, making up things on the spot in order to get out of uncomfortable questions. And so why should this be any different? But and also, too, I believe there's building materials in these squibs as they're coming out. So it's not air pressure. It is, it's mistimed.
Yeah, I look forward to the day where we can ask NIST these questions, because they're going to be struggling, like they were in their draft press conference, to explain, first to deny that Building 7 came down to free fall, and then at free fall acceleration, and then to try to explain, oh yeah, it did, but that's consistent with our previous hypothesis. So they're always between a rock and a hard place, and it shows. And you can just put yourself in their position and feel the pressure, and feel the sting of one's own conscience at having to lie to justify some of these positions that they have found themselves in, and deal with the evidence that people are throwing at them that has been compiled by AE 9/11 Truth. I feel sorry for them. Do you, Andy?
No, it's very hard for me to feel sorry for these people. So, I think they deserve every challenge and every uncomfortable moment that they get. You make a decision, even when you go work at some place, about what you're going to go along with, what you're going to cover up. And ultimately, what happens to you falls on the shoulders of you yourself. You can't just say I was just following orders or whatever. I've been put in unsafe situations when I was young, working in kitchens and things like that, and I would refuse to do certain things, even against pressure to do so. And one time it was even proven to be a smart decision because somebody else got hurt. So, you are ultimately responsible for yourself, and no matter what amount of pressure, unless they're holding a gun to your head or something, if you go along with a cover-up like this, then you deserve the
Very
consequences.
well stated.
That's my opinion.
And today we were looking at part 2 of 9/11: An Architect's Guide, the Twin Towers' Explosive Destruction. And we looked at explosions, the sudden near free fall collapses, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the structural steel frame, the mid-air pulverization of concrete. Next week, we're going to jump into the extreme heat associated with the Twin Towers in great detail, pyroclastic-like clouds, extreme heat there, and in the aftermath of the Twin Towers collapse, and then the molten steel and iron that cannot be possibly accounted for by the official story, nor the iron microspheres, which are accountable only to thermite, nanothermite. So all of that and a lot more next week, Thursday at 1 o'clock. And then we'll be done in November with the 3-part series. And we start again in December with World Trade Center Building 7. So join us the first Thursday in December to learn about the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11 into its own footprint in under 7 seconds in the exact manner of a classic controlled demolition. And we'll find out what brought that building down too. So I've been grateful to have you today. I appreciate your patience and kindness, and thanks for the help, Andy. And we will see everybody next week. Bye for now.